November 16, 1944. 13,000 feet above Ulithi Atoll, Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Shiga leveled his Nakajima C-6N reconnaissance aircraft into a gentle banking turn. Through the crystal-clear Pacific air, what lay below defied comprehension. The lagoon stretched 20 miles long and 10 miles wide, sheltered by a coral ring so remote it barely appeared on most navigation charts. Yet within that vast natural harbour, Shiga counted ships in a manner he had never been taught. Not tens of vessels, not even dozens. Over 200 American warships and cargo vessels lay at anchor in perfect rows, their hulls creating a steel forest that filled every navigable section of the anchorage. 4 fleet carriers, 3 battleships, cruisers and destroyers beyond immediate count, and filling the southern and central portions of the lagoon, an impossible sight that Shiga struggled to process. Merchant vessels, tankers, and transports in such quantities that they appeared to blend into a single unbroken mass of grey steel. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. In his cramped cockpit, Shiga photographed methodically, his camera recording what his mind refused to accept. He had studied American industrial capacity and training. He had reviewed intelligence estimates of enemy ship production. The numbers on those charts had seemed impossibly large, theoretical calculations that surely represented exaggeration or deception. Yet here, concentrated in a single atoll that Japan had dismissed as strategically worthless, floated evidence that transformed abstract statistics into concrete reality. What Shiga could not know during that reconnaissance flight was that he was witnessing the material expression of a fundamental miscalculation. Japanese naval planners had designed their entire war strategy around the assumption that quality would triumph over quantity, that superior tactics and training would compensate for industrial inferiority. They had calculated carefully, determining that if Japan could sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping monthly, victory would become inevitable. American shipyards, in the month Shiga flew his reconnaissance mission, launched over 1 million tons of new shipping. The impossible had become routine, the unthinkable had become a standard production schedule, and concentrated at Ulithi Atoll, in an anchorage so vast it dwarfed Pearl Harbor, floating the proof that industrial might would determine this war's outcome regardless of tactical brilliance or martial courage. 5 months earlier, on September 23, 1944, the 323rd Regimental Combat Team of the 81st Infantry Division had waded ashore at Ulithi expecting resistance. They found 400 native inhabitants and 17 Japanese soldiers manning a weather station. The atoll's strategic value, invisible to Japanese planners, had been obvious to Admiral Chester Nimitz the moment he examined Pacific charts. The massive lagoon, capable of anchoring 700 ships, sat perfectly positioned 1,300 miles south of Tokyo, 850 miles east of the Philippines, and 360 miles southwest of Guam. Within days of the unopposed landing, construction battalions arrived and transformed coral islets into the largest naval base in the Pacific. No permanent facilities were constructed, no oil tank farms or massive dry docks. Instead, the Navy maintained a floating city. 6 to 8 obsolete tankers served as mobile fuel storage, each holding 60,000 to 80,000 barrels. Repair ships, destroyer tenders, and floating dry docks created a complete industrial complex that could service everything from patrol boats to battleships. By early November 1944, when Shiga conducted his reconnaissance flight, Ulithi functioned as the forward operating base for operations against the Philippines. What appeared in his reconnaissance photographs represented just a fraction of the total American naval presence in the Pacific, yet even this partial glimpse revealed a truth that Japanese naval officers had spent 3 years trying to deny. They were fighting an industrial war with pre-industrial assumptions about victory. The path to this realization had begun 3 years earlier, in a planning room in Tokyo where Admiral Yamamoto reviewed wargame results with growing pessimism. Unlike many senior Japanese naval officers, Yamamoto had spent years in America, first as a student at Harvard, then as naval attaché in Washington. He had toured American factories, observed industrial production, and studied economic statistics that painted an unmistakable picture. In meetings with Japan's political leadership during summer 1941, Yamamoto stated his position bluntly. In the first 6 to 12 months of war with the United States, he could run wild and achieve victory after victory. But if the conflict extended beyond that initial period, he had no expectation of success. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Japan's entire annual steel production equaled what a single major American corporation, United States Steel, produced. American automobile factories manufactured more vehicles in 1 year than Japan had built in its entire industrial history. When Japanese Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe asked Yamamoto about Japan's chances in a prolonged conflict, the admiral's response carried no diplomatic softening. The only way Japan could win a war against America would be to march into Washington and dictate terms in the White House. This was not boastful rhetoric, but a statement of impossibility. Yamamoto understood that military victory against an opponent with 10 times Japan's industrial capacity and 5 times its steel production was not difficult. It was mathematically impossible. Yet Yamamoto's warnings, clear as they were, could not overcome the momentum toward war. Japanese military doctrine had been shaped by decisive victory at the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where superior tactics and training had destroyed a Russian fleet. That victory created a dangerous template, the belief that a single decisive battle could end a war, regardless of the broader strategic situation. Japanese naval planners refined this concept into Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine, which assumed that a climactic engagement in waters near Japan would decide the entire Pacific campaign. This doctrine shaped every aspect of Japanese naval preparation. Training focused obsessively on surface combat tactics. Resources concentrated on battleships and carriers designed to win that single decisive engagement. And critically, Japan invested almost nothing in merchant shipping protection, convoy escorts, or the unglamorous logistics that sustained industrial warfare. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the war with 24 escort vessels to protect supply lines spanning the entire Western Pacific. The American industrial response began before Pearl Harbor. On December 27, 1940, the United States Maritime Commission signed its first contract with Henry Kaiser, a construction magnate who had never built a ship. Traditional shipbuilders dismissed Kaiser as an outsider who understood neither maritime tradition nor proper vessel construction. What Kaiser understood was mass production. Within 18 months, his shipyards would begin launching Liberty ships at rates that seemed impossible to anyone who understood conventional shipbuilding. The Liberty ship, officially the Maritime Commission Standard EC2-S-C1 emergency cargo ship, embodied pragmatic simplicity. At 441 feet long and displacing 14,245 tons, these vessels carried no advanced technology, no sophisticated weapons, no naval architecture innovation. They featured straightforward reciprocating steam engines, technology that dated to the 19th century but required no complex maintenance. Their hulls used welding instead of traditional riveting, allowing workers with weeks of training to perform tasks that previously demanded years of apprenticeship. Traditional maritime engineers considered Liberty ships crude, inelegant, barely seaworthy compromises built by people who understood nothing about proper naval construction. Vice Admiral Emery Land, chairman of the Maritime Commission, examined Kaiser's early proposals with deep skepticism. Welding had never been proven reliable for hull construction at such scale. The British Navy forbade welding on warship hulls. Yet Land also recognized desperation. German U-boats were sinking Allied shipping faster than traditional yards could replace vessels. Conventional construction required an average of 230 days per ship. At that pace, the Allies would lose the Battle of the Atlantic before American industry could respond. The decision to approve Kaiser's contract represented not confidence, but necessity. If his experimental methods failed, the loss would be measured in millions of dollars and political embarrassment. If traditional methods continued, the loss would be measured in starved populations and defeated armies. Between those options, experimentation became policy. The first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, launched on September 27, 1941, after 244 days of construction. It seemed an acceptable, if unspectacular, beginning. Then Kaiser's shipyards began applying assembly line principles borrowed from automobile manufacturing. Workers prefabricated massive hull sections in workshops, then assembled them using electric arc welding. Construction time dropped precipitously. The first ship required 197 days, the second, 169 days, the 10th, 97 days. By spring 1942, Richmond Shipyard was completing Liberty ships in 70 days on average. In November 1942, Kaiser demonstrated the ultimate expression of prefabrication efficiency. The SS Robert E. Peary, hull number 47 at Richmond Yard number 2, slid down the launching rails 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after its keel touched the building way. This was not normal construction but a publicity stunt designed to demonstrate capability. Yet, the stunt proved a point. When Henry Kaiser told traditional maritime authorities that shipbuilding could be reimagined as manufacturing, that complex vessels could be mass-produced like automobiles, they had considered him ignorant. Robert E. Peary stood as evidence that their assumptions about shipbuilding limits were simply wrong. By mid-1943, American production had reached scales that Japanese planners considered impossible even when presented with verified intelligence. 18 shipyards across the United States built Liberty ships using prefabrication and welding. Average construction time had fallen to 42 days. The United States was launching 3 Liberty ships daily, more tonnage than German submarines could sink, more vessels than Japanese planners believed American industry capable of producing. The implications terrified those Japanese officers capable of understanding them. Admiral Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat force, had calculated that submarines needed to sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping monthly to strangle Britain. The highest monthly total U-boats ever achieved was 729,000 tons in November 1942. That same month, American shipyards launched over 1 million tons of new shipping. The mathematics of industrial warfare were clear. The side that could replace losses faster than enemies could and inflict them would win regardless of tactical skill or operational brilliance. Japanese intelligence officers, reviewing reports from neutral observers and captured documents, struggled to verify numbers that seemed to represent either exaggeration or deliberate deception. In January 1942, Japan had launched its offensive across the Pacific, confident that American shipbuilding capacity, while substantial, could not possibly compensate for ships Japan would sink through superior tactics and training. By January 1943, American yards had launched 646 ships, totaling over 5 million tons. In that same period, Japanese submarines and aircraft had sunk a fraction of that tonnage. The disparity only widened. In 1943, American shipyards produced 1,238 Liberty ships, totaling over 11 million tons. This represented more merchant shipping than the entire Japanese merchant fleet at the war's beginning. And these were merely the Liberty ships. American yards also produced Victory ships, T-2 tankers, escort carriers converted from merchant hulls, and hundreds of specialized vessel types. Total American maritime production for 1943 exceeded 19 million tons, more than double Japan's entire merchant fleet. Japanese shipbuilding, constrained by limited resources and traditional construction methods, could not match even a fraction of American output. Where American yards employed hundreds of thousands of workers using simplified assembly line techniques, Japanese yards relied on skilled craftsmen using time-intensive traditional methods. A Liberty ship required approximately 486,000 worker hours by 1943. A comparable Japanese merchant vessel required over 1 million worker hours. The productivity difference was not marginal but categorical. And unlike Japanese industry, which faced constant resource shortages as American submarines strangled supply lines, American yards operated with seemingly limitless access to steel, fuel, and materials. The Kaiser shipyards alone, 7 facilities spread across California, Oregon, and Washington, employed nearly 200,000 workers at peak production in 1944. This exceeded the entire workforce of Japan's merchant shipbuilding industry. A single American company had more production capacity than Japan's entire maritime construction sector. The human dimension of this industrial disparity mattered as much as the raw statistics. Kaiser's yards employed tens of thousands of women and minorities in skilled positions, including welding, fitting, and crane operation. This represented both a massive expansion of America's industrial workforce and a fundamental reimagining of who could perform skilled manufacturing. Traditional shipyards had required generational expertise, knowledge passed from father to son across decades. Kaiser proved that complex manufacturing could be performed by trained workers rather than requiring generational craft expertise. His training schools produced productive welders in 2 weeks, crane operators in 4 weeks, ship fitters in 6 weeks. This democratization of skilled work carried implications far beyond wartime production. By proving that industrial capacity could be created quickly through systematic training rather than requiring years of apprenticeship, Kaiser's shipyards challenged fundamental assumptions about labor, skill, and manufacturing capability. The implications for post-war economic development would echo for decades. But in 1944, the immediate implication was military. An enemy that could train 100,000 workers in weeks possessed industrial flexibility that rendered traditional calculations about production limits obsolete. For Japanese officers examining intelligence reports about American production, the numbers created a psychological crisis that tactics and courage could not address. The entire Japanese war strategy had been predicated on assumptions about American industrial limits that were proving catastrophically wrong. Japan had calculated that aggressive operations could sink enough Allied shipping to force a negotiated peace before American industry fully mobilized. That strategy had failed decisively by mid-1943. American production had not just matched Japanese sinking rates. It had exceeded them by factors that transformed the entire strategic equation. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding the destroyer Shigure, recorded his growing unease in his war diary during 1943. Earlier in the war, Japanese destroyers had operated with confidence, their superior night fighting capabilities and long-lance torpedoes providing tactical advantage against Allied vessels. By mid-1943, Hara noted a transformation. American ships appeared in quantities that rendered tactical superiority irrelevant. Where once Japan might face a handful of destroyers in an engagement, now American task forces contained dozens. The tactical advantage of superior torpedoes mattered little when facing 10 times as many enemy vessels. More disturbing still was the quality of American equipment, which improved continuously despite massive production volume. Early in the war, Japanese officers had noted American radar as primitive and unreliable. By 1943, American vessels carried radar systems that detected Japanese ships at ranges exceeding visual identification by miles. American fire control systems, integrated with radar, allowed accurate gunnery in darkness and weather conditions that rendered Japanese optical systems useless. The psychological impact of facing an enemy that grew stronger as the war progressed, rather than weaker, corroded Japanese morale in ways that official propaganda could not address. Japanese sailors understood mathematics. They counted the enemy, ships they faced in each engagement, and noted that American numbers increased month by month. They observed that damaged American vessels disappeared for repair and returned to service, while damaged Japanese ships often remained out of action for months due to repair facility shortages. They witnessed American supply ships delivering fresh provisions and fuel regularly, while Japanese supply lines grew increasingly tenuous as American submarines claimed growing tolls. Commander Toshikazu Omai, a staff officer with the combined fleet, observed this psychological transformation firsthand during 1944. In planning meetings, senior officers who had once spoken confidently about decisive victory now discussed defensive operations and strategic withdrawals. The language changed subtly but unmistakably. Where once planners had talked about destroying the American fleet, now they discussed inflicting casualties sufficient to make continued American advance too costly. This shift from seeking victory to hoping for stalemate revealed how thoroughly the material realities of industrial warfare had undermined Japan's strategic position. The November 16th reconnaissance flight over Ulithi represented the culmination of this gradual realization. Lieutenant Commander Shiga's photographs, when delivered to Combined Fleet Headquarters, generated intense debate. Some senior officers insisted the images must represent some form of deception, that the Americans had concentrated their entire Pacific Fleet at Ulithi for Shiga to photograph, creating a false impression of overwhelming strength. Others, examining the photographs with growing despair, recognized that Ulithi likely represented only a fraction of total American naval strength in the Pacific. Intelligence officers, cross-referencing Shiga's photographs with reports from other reconnaissance missions and radio intercepts, confirmed the pessimists' fears. The concentration at Ulithi was merely one of several major American fleet anchorages across the Pacific. Pearl Harbor remained fully operational. Eniwetok and Majuro atolls hosted additional fleet concentrations. The ships at Ulithi represented not America's total naval strength, but simply the forces being staged for the upcoming Philippines operations. This realization carried devastating strategic implications. Japanese war planning had assumed that the American Pacific Fleet, while substantial, represented a finite force that could be attrited through aggressive operations. Sink enough American carriers, destroy enough battleships, inflict sufficient casualties on American crews, and eventually the enemy fleet would be depleted beyond its ability to sustain offensive operations. Yet the photographs from Ulithi revealed a different reality. The American fleet was not being depleted, it was growing. Month by month, new vessels appeared in quantities that exceeded Japanese losses inflicted. The Liberty ships filling Ulithi's southern anchorage area represented the most psychologically devastating element of Shiga's reconnaissance photographs. These were not warships, not the carriers and battleships that dominated naval planning. These were merchant vessels, cargo ships, tankers, and transports. Yet their presence in such overwhelming numbers revealed the industrial foundation that sustained American naval operations. Each carrier task force required a train of supply ships, delivering fuel, ammunition, provisions, and spare parts. The Liberty ships and other merchant vessels at Ulithi demonstrated that American logistics operated on a scale that rendered Japanese calculations about sustaining offensive operations obsolete. Japanese logistics, by contrast, had become the critical limiting factor in all operations by late 1944. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who assumed command of the combined fleet after Admiral Koga's death in March 1944, faced constant fuel shortages that restricted training and limited operational options. Japanese carriers sat in port not because they lacked crews or aircraft, but because fuel shortages made operations impossible. When the mobile fleet sortied for the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, fuel considerations dominated every tactical decision. The fleet could not remain at sea for extended periods. It could not conduct repeated strikes. Every operation had to be planned around fuel availability, rather than tactical optimum. American task forces, by contrast, operated with fuel abundance that Japanese planners considered impossible. Fleet oilers shuttled from Ulithi to operational areas, refueling warships at sea and allowing American carriers to remain in combat zones for weeks. This operational flexibility, sustained by industrial capacity beyond Japanese comprehension, meant that American forces could maintain constant offensive pressure, while Japanese forces had to carefully husband limited resources for brief, decisive operations. The human cost of this industrial disparity grew increasingly apparent throughout 1944. Japanese pilots, trained through increasingly abbreviated programs as fuel shortages limited flight training, faced American aviators who had received hundreds of hours of instruction. Japanese aircraft, often older models as production shortfalls prevented rapid replacement, engaged American fighters and bombers that incorporated the latest technological advances. Japanese ships, operating with deteriorating maintenance as spare parts grew scarce, fought American vessels fresh from shipyard overhauls. Yet perhaps the cruelest element of this industrial imbalance was the knowledge among informed Japanese officers that the disparity would only worsen. American production was not at peak capacity in November 1944. Shipyards continued expanding. New workers entered the industrial workforce daily. Production methods continued improving. The tidal wave of American industrial output that had seemed overwhelming in 1943 was merely the beginning of a tsunami that would continue growing through the war's end. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. When Shiga's reconnaissance photographs reached senior planning staff at Combined Fleet Headquarters, the response split along predictable lines. Older officers, whose entire careers had been shaped by the decisive battle doctrine and the assumption that martial spirit could overcome material disadvantage, insisted that the photographs proved nothing. Yes, the Americans had assembled a large fleet at Ulithi, but size did not equal fighting spirit. Japanese forces, properly employed with aggressive tactics and willing sacrifice, could inflict casualties that would break American morale and force a negotiated peace. Younger staff officers, many of whom had studied American industrial capacity more carefully and understood the mathematics of attrition warfare, recognized that the photographs from Ulithi represented not merely a tactical challenge but a strategic impossibility. One could not defeat an enemy capable of replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted. One could not win a war of attrition against an opponent with 10 times the industrial capacity. One could not sustain offensive operations when every engagement resulted in irreplaceable losses, while the enemy's losses were replaced within weeks. Captain Atsushi Oi, a staff officer who survived the war and later wrote extensively about Japanese naval operations, recalled the growing sense of futility that pervaded planning meetings during late 1944. Officers conducted their duties professionally, planning operations and reviewing intelligence, but underlying every discussion was the unspoken recognition that Japan was fighting an unwinnable war. The question was no longer how to achieve victory, but how to extract some acceptable terms from inevitable defeat. This psychological transformation affected different officers in different ways. Some, particularly those in combat commands, suppressed their understanding of strategic reality and focused on immediate tactical objectives. If Japan could not win the war, at least individual units could fight honorably and inflict casualties on the enemy. This mindset would lead directly to the kamikaze tactics adopted in late 1944, the recognition that conventional operations could no longer inflict sufficient damage on American forces, but that suicide attacks might achieve tactical results that justified their terrible cost. Others, particularly staff officers responsible for logistics and strategic planning, found themselves in an impossible position. Their analyses clearly demonstrated that Japan lacked the resources to sustain continued operations. Fuel shortages, ammunition scarcity, spare parts deficiencies, and trained personnel shortfalls all pointed toward inevitable collapse. Yet presenting this analysis to senior leadership often resulted in accusations of defeatism or worse. The institutional culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy, shaped by decades of success and the decisive battle doctrine, could not accept that material reality might render tactical brilliance irrelevant. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who would later become one of the principal advocates for kamikaze tactics, articulated this tension in a staff meeting during October 1944. Japan faced an enemy with overwhelming material superiority, he acknowledged. Conventional tactics could not overcome this disparity. Yet Japan still possessed one resource that could not be quantified in production statistics: the willingness of young men to sacrifice their lives for the empire. If conventional attacks resulted in minimal damage before aircraft were shot down, perhaps deliberately crashing aircraft into enemy ships would achieve results that justified the loss of pilot and plane. This logic, however desperate, reflected a fundamental truth about Japan's strategic position by late 1944. The industrial war was lost. American production had grown to levels that rendered Japanese attrition calculations meaningless. The only remaining question was whether Japan could inflict sufficient casualties to secure some negotiated settlement short of total defeat. The kamikaze attacks, whatever their moral implications, represented a logical if terrible response to strategic impossibility. The ships at Ulithi that Shiga photographed in November 1944 would soon experience the consequences of this desperation. On March 11, 1945, 24 P-1Y Francis bombers attempted a kamikaze attack on the anchorage. Mechanical problems, weather and fuel exhaustion would reduce this force to 2 aircraft that actually reached Ulithi. One would crash into the carrier Randolph, inflicting casualties of 25 killed and 106 wounded, but causing damage repairable in less than a month. The other would crash into an illuminated baseball diamond, killing the crew but inflicting no military damage. This attack, intended to demonstrate that American fleet concentrations were vulnerable even in rear areas, instead proved the opposite. Despite achieving complete surprise in an undefended anchorage, the kamikaze aircraft managed to damage only 1 warship out of over 600 vessels at anchor. The Randolph, despite the kamikaze hit, was repaired at Ulithi and rejoined operations within weeks. The attack demonstrated not Japanese capability but American resilience, the capacity to absorb damage and continue operations sustained by industrial depth that Japan could not match. The story of Ulithi and the ships that filled its anchorage in November 1944 ultimately exemplifies the decisive role of PLICE, industrial capacity in modern warfare. Tactical brilliance matters, training and morale matter, technology and innovation matter. But underlying all these factors, industrial capacity determines which side can sustain operations, replace losses, maintain supply lines, and ultimately achieve victory regardless of temporary tactical defeats. Japanese naval officers had understood this intellectually before the war. Yamamoto's warnings about American industrial capacity were clear and prescient. Yet, understanding industrial disparity intellectually and confronting its reality operationally created very different psychological experiences. When Japanese pilots had attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they had damaged an American fleet that seemed substantial but finite. When Lieutenant Commander Shiga photographed Ulithi in November 1944, he documented an American fleet that seemed infinite, growing rather than shrinking despite 3 years of intensive combat operations. The intelligence assessment that accompanied Shiga's reconnaissance photographs landed on Admiral Toyoda's desk on November 20, 1944. The report's conclusions, drafted by staff officers who had spent months analyzing American production capacity, carried none of the diplomatic softening that typically characterized official documents. The concentration of vessels at Ulithi represented approximately 1/3 of total American naval strength in the Pacific Theater. American shipyards were currently producing merchant vessels at a rate exceeding 3 per day. Japanese submarine and air attacks were sinking Allied shipping at less than 1/10 the replacement rate. Toyoda read the assessment in silence, then placed it in a folder marked for restricted distribution. The conclusions were mathematically sound and strategically catastrophic. Sharing them widely would accomplish nothing except undermining morale among officers who still believed aggressive tactics could achieve victory. Yet keeping them restricted meant that operational planning continued, based on assumptions that intelligence had proven false. It was an impossible dilemma with no satisfactory resolution. The American operations launched from Ulithi in the months following Shiga's reconnaissance flight demonstrated exactly what those intelligence assessments had predicted. On February 19, 1945, the largest amphibious force yet assembled in the Pacific departed Ulithi for the invasion of Iwo Jima. Over 450 ships participated, including 11 fleet carriers, 6 battleships, and 5 escort carriers, supported by dozens of destroyers, cruisers, and hundreds of amphibious vessels and transports. The logistics tail supporting this operation included tankers carrying 600,000 gallons of fuel oil, ammunition ships equivalent to 1,500 freight cars of ordnance, and provision ships carrying enough food to feed every resident of Vermont and Wyoming for 15 days. Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, commanded by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had constructed elaborate defenses, expecting to face a substantial American assault. What they encountered exceeded their most pessimistic projections. American naval gunfire support operated with ammunition abundance that Japanese planners considered impossible. When shore fire control parties called for bombardment, American battleships and cruisers responded with sustained fire that consumed thousands of shells daily. Japanese defensive positions, however elaborate, faced systematic destruction by an enemy that possessed seemingly unlimited ammunition. The air support dimension proved equally overwhelming. American carriers operating off Iwo Jima launched strike after strike, their aircraft returning, rearming, refueling, and launching again in continuous cycles. Japanese defenders, lacking air support of any kind, could only endure bombardment with no possibility of response. The psychological impact of facing an enemy with absolute control of sea and air, sustained by logistics beyond Japanese comprehension, wore down even the most determined defenders. Kuribayashi's forces fought with extraordinary tenacity, inflicting casualties that made Iwo Jima the costliest battle in Marine Corps history. Yet, despite this ferocious resistance, despite defensive preparations more elaborate than any previous Pacific battle, American forces secured the island in 36 days. The victory demonstrated not tactical superiority but industrial dominance. When defenders destroyed American equipment, replacement equipment appeared within days. When ammunition stocks ran low, supply ships delivered fresh stocks. When casualties mounted, replacement personnel arrived on transports that shuttled continuously from rear areas. The Liberty ships that Japanese officers had observed at Ulithi played essential if unglamorous roles in this operation. They carried the fuel that powered American vehicles. They transported the ammunition that American artillery expended by the thousands of rounds daily. They delivered the provisions that fed assault forces, the construction materials that Seabees used to build airfields, the medical supplies that treated casualties. These merchant vessels, individually insignificant and collectively overwhelming, represented the logistical foundation that sustained American offensive operations. By March 1945, Ulithi's anchorage reached its maximum capacity. On March 13, 647 ships lay at anchor, and with the arrival of amphibious forces staging for the invasion of Okinawa, the total peaked at 722 vessels. For several weeks, this remote coral atoll hosted a temporary population exceeding that of most American cities, a floating metropolis dedicated entirely to sustaining military operations 1,500 miles to the north. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft, when they could penetrate American air defenses, photographed this concentration with growing desperation. Each image confirmed what intelligence analysts already knew. American naval strength was not diminishing despite 3 years of intensive combat. Every Japanese victory, every American ship sunk, every enemy aircraft destroyed represented merely temporary tactical success. Within weeks, replacement vessels appeared. New aircraft replaced those lost. The American fleet grew larger month by month while Japanese naval strength declined irreversibly. Commander Yoshimori Terai, a submarine officer who conducted multiple patrols during 1945, recorded his impressions of this transformation in his war diary. Early in the war, Japanese submarines had operated with confidence, their superior range and torpedo technology providing tactical advantages against Allied vessels. By 1945, submarine operations had become suicide missions with minimal prospect of success. American convoy escorts detected submarines at ranges that made attack approaches nearly impossible. When submarines did achieve attack positions, American damage control proved so effective that ships survived multiple torpedo hits and returned to service. More dispiriting still was the recognition that even successful attacks achieved nothing strategically significant. Terai's submarine, I-56, sank 3 American merchant ships during a patrol off the Philippines in March 1945. These represented tactically successful attacks requiring weeks of dangerous operations. Yet Terai recognized that American shipyards had likely launched a dozen replacement vessels during the same period his submarines spent achieving these 3 sinkings. The mathematics of attrition warfare, clearly visible to anyone capable of understanding them, revealed that Japan could not sink ships faster than America built them. The Okinawa operation, launched from Ulithi on March 21, 1945, represented the ultimate expression of American industrial dominance. Over 1,400 ships participated, the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific War. The invasion force included more vessels than the entire Imperial Japanese Navy possessed at its peak strength. The logistics supporting this operation operated at scales that defied Japanese comprehension. American forces consumed supplies at rates exceeding entire Japanese divisions. Yet supply ships maintained constant flow of provisions, ammunition, and fuel. Japanese defenders on Okinawa, recognizing that conventional defense could not defeat an enemy with such overwhelming material superiority, adopted tactics designed to inflict maximum casualties rather than achieve victory. Kamikaze attacks intensified, with over 1,900 suicide sorties launched against American vessels between April and June 1945. These attacks achieved tactical successes, sinking dozens of vessels and damaging hundreds more. Yet even this terrible sacrifice could not alter strategic reality. American naval losses at Okinawa, substantial as they were, represented merely temporary operational setbacks. Damaged vessels retired to Ulithi for repair. Service Squadron 10, Admiral Nimitz's secret weapon, effected repairs that would have required months in rear area facilities. Vessels with major damage returned to Pearl Harbor or West Coast yards, where repair capacity exceeded anything Japan could marshal. And throughout these operations, Liberty ships continued delivering the supplies that sustained American forces, regardless of casualties or equipment losses. Captain Rikihei Inaguchi, a staff officer who helped organize kamikaze operations, later wrote about the psychological burden of watching young pilots depart on suicide missions, while knowing these sacrifices could not change the war's outcome. Each kamikaze attack required extraordinary courage from pilots who deliberately crashed aircraft into enemy ships. Yet staff officers examining battle damage assessments recognized that even successful attacks inflicted damage that American industry repaired within weeks. Japan was expending irreplaceable human resources to achieve temporary tactical victories against an enemy that could absorb such losses indefinitely. The final months of the war, from April through August 1945, witnessed the complete collapse of Japan's capacity to conduct meaningful naval operations. Fuel shortages immobilized remaining warships. Pilot shortages grounded surviving aircraft. Supply shortages left ground forces inadequately equipped. Yet American operations continued at intensity levels that seemed to increase rather than diminish as victory approached. The contrast between Japanese and American logistics reached its starkest expression during the final months. Japanese forces on bypassed islands faced starvation as American submarines and aircraft interrupted all supply efforts. Historians estimate that as many as 60% of Japanese military deaths during the war resulted from starvation and disease rather than combat. Meanwhile, American forces operated with supply abundance that Japanese soldiers found incomprehensible when they examined captured supply dumps. One Japanese officer, interrogated after capture on Okinawa, expressed disbelief when shown American field rations. He had assumed American propaganda photographs of well-fed soldiers represented deception. Confronting actual American logistics revealed that the photographs had understated rather than exaggerated American supply abundance. Admiral Menechi Koga, before his death in March 1944, had told his staff officers that Japan faced not merely military defeat, but industrial annihilation. The Americans were not fighting a war in the traditional sense of seeking territorial gains or political objectives. They were demonstrating industrial capacity, proving that American factories could produce war materials faster than any enemy could destroy them. This demonstration carried implications far beyond the immediate conflict. It announced to the world that American industrial supremacy was not a temporary advantage, but a fundamental reality that would shape global politics for generations. By July 1945, when Ulithi's importance had diminished as American forces moved north toward Japan proper, the atoll had hosted over 1 million ship movements. Thousands of vessels had anchored in its lagoon. Tens of thousands of sailors had enjoyed recreation on Mogmog Island. Hundreds of damaged ships had received repairs. The floating city that Japanese planners had dismissed as impossible had operated for 10 months at efficiency levels exceeding permanent rear area bases. And this represented merely one element of American logistics in the Pacific theater. Japanese officers who survived the war and later wrote memoirs struggled to articulate the psychological impact of confronting industrial capacity beyond their comprehension. Commander Masatake Okumiya, who served throughout the war and became a prominent post-war analyst, wrote that Japanese naval aviation had been defeated not by American pilots or tactics but by American factories. Yes, American pilots were well trained and their aircraft incorporated advanced technology, but the decisive advantage was quantitative. Where Japanese carriers operated with complements of 60 to 70 aircraft, American carriers embarked 80 to 90 planes. Where Japanese air groups, once depleted, required months to rebuild, American carriers received replacement aircraft and pilots within weeks. This industrial advantage compounded throughout the war. Early Japanese victories had inflicted significant losses on American forces. The carrier Lexington sank at Coral Sea. The carrier Yorktown went down at Midway. The carrier Hornet was lost at Santa Cruz. Yet by mid-1943, American carrier strength exceeded the total at war's beginning. Essex-class carriers appeared at rates exceeding 1 per month. Independence-class light carriers, converted from cruiser hulls, provided additional air strength, and escort carriers, converted from merchant hulls, operated by the dozens, providing air cover for convoys and amphibious operations. Japanese carrier construction, by contrast, could not replace losses. The carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu went down at Midway in June 1942. Japan laid down replacement carriers, but construction times were measured in years. Resource shortages delayed completion. By the time new carriers entered service, pilot shortages prevented effective operations. The carrier Taiho, completed in March 1944 and sunk 3 months later at the Philippine Sea, operated for less time than American shipyards required to build a Liberty ship. The fundamental asymmetry in this industrial competition meant that time favored America absolutely. Each month, the war continued. American production increased while Japanese capacity declined. Each engagement, regardless of tactical outcome, depleted irreplaceable Japanese resources, while American losses were made good within weeks. By mid-1945, this process had reached its inevitable conclusion. Japan possessed nothing resembling offensive capability. American forces operated with complete freedom of action, constrained only by logistical limits that rarely materialized thanks to merchant shipping abundance. On August 6, 1945, the cruiser Indianapolis, which had departed Ulithi on July 26 carrying components for the atomic bomb, contributed to operations that rendered further conventional fighting meaningless. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with Soviet entry into the war, forced Japan's surrender on August 15. Yet, even without atomic weapons, Japan's position had become untenable. American forces were preparing Operation Downfall, the invasion of the home islands, with logistics that would have dwarfed even the Okinawa operation. The planned invasion would have employed thousands of ships, many of them Liberty ships, carrying the supplies necessary to sustain millions of troops during operations expected to last into 1946. American planners anticipated high casualties but possessed confidence that industrial capacity would sustain operations regardless of losses. Japan, by contrast, lacked fuel, ammunition, food, and functioning transportation infrastructure. Defeat was mathematically certain regardless of how determinedly Japanese forces fought. Admiral Toyoda, who signed the surrender documents aboard the battleship Missouri on September 2, 1945, later wrote about the moment when he truly understood Japan had lost the war. It was not at any particular battle, not even after the atomic bombings. It was during a staff meeting in late 1944 when intelligence officers presented reconnaissance photographs from Ulithi. The sheer number of ships visible in those images, the recognition that this represented only a fraction of American naval strength, and the knowledge that American production continued expanding, all combined to create inescapable recognition that Japan was fighting an unwinnable war. Other Japanese officers recorded similar moments of realization. For some, it came when examining battle damage assessments that revealed how quickly Americans repaired damaged vessels. For others, it emerged from logistics reports showing that American forces consumed supplies at rates exceeding entire Japanese divisions' total allocations. And for many, the recognition arrived gradually, accumulating through countless small observations until the cumulative weight became undeniable. Captain Tameichi Hara, one of the few Japanese destroyer captains to survive the war, wrote in his memoir that he had understood Japan would lose by mid-1943. The Americans simply had too many ships, too much ammunition, too many aircraft. Japanese tactical victories, however brilliant, could not overcome this material disparity. Yet Hara continued fighting for 2 more years, fulfilling his duty despite knowing the ultimate outcome. This psychological split between professional obligation and recognition of inevitable defeat characterized the experience of many Japanese officers during the war's final years. The Liberty ships that filled Ulithi's anchorage in November 1944 ultimately carried more than cargo across Pacific waters. They carried proof that industrial capacity determined modern warfare's outcome. They demonstrated that mass production could overwhelm tactical excellence. They showed that a nation capable of building 3 ships daily possessed military advantages that courage and training could not overcome. And most devastatingly for Japanese officers who had spent careers believing that warrior spirit transcended material limitations, Liberty ships proved that sufficient quantity becomes its own quality in industrial warfare. The 2,710 Liberty ships built between 1941 and 1945 represented merely the most visible element of American industrial mobilization. Behind those ships stood the shipyards that built them, employing hundreds of thousands of workers. Behind the yards stood the steel mills that provided material. Behind the mills stood the mines that extracted ore. Behind all of this stood an economy that converted to war production without sacrificing civilian welfare, that maintained living standards while producing war materials at rates exceeding all enemies combined. Japan, fighting with an economy 1/10 America's size and resources far more limited, had attempted industrial warfare against an opponent for whom industrial production was not sacrifice but routine. The result was never in doubt to anyone capable of understanding economic fundamentals. What remained uncertain was how long Japan would continue fighting before accepting inevitable defeat. The atomic bombs provided political justification for surrender that preserved some measure of national honor. Without them, conventional operations would have achieved the same result, merely at higher cost in lives on both sides. The crews who sailed Liberty ships rarely received recognition for their contributions. Maritime service lacked the glamour of carrier aviation or the drama of infantry combat. Yet merchant mariners faced dangers equal to any combat branch. German U-boats and Japanese submarines sank hundreds of merchant vessels. Kamikaze attacks targeted transports as well as warships. Storms, mechanical failures, and accidents claimed additional vessels. The merchant marine suffered casualty rates exceeding most military branches, yet their service received limited public acknowledgement. For Japanese officers who understood what Liberty ships represented, these vessels embodied everything their war planning had failed to anticipate. Yes, American carriers and battleships were formidable. Yes, American tactical capabilities improved throughout the war. But underlying all American military operations was logistics sustained by merchant shipping in quantities that rendered Japanese calculations about supply limitations meaningless. When American forces needed fuel, Liberty ships delivered it. When ammunition ran low, cargo vessels arrived with fresh stocks. When equipment wore out, transports brought replacements. This logistical abundance created military capabilities that tactics alone could not overcome. American forces operated with freedom of action that resource constraints never limited. They could maintain offensive pressure continuously because supplies arrived regularly. They could recover from tactical defeats quickly because replacement equipment appeared within days. They could sustain casualties that would have crippled Japanese units because personnel replacements flowed from training programs that graduated thousands of new service members monthly. The final irony was that Liberty ships, designed as emergency vessels with expected service lives of 5 years, proved remarkably durable. Many remained in service for decades after the war. The SS John W. Brown and SS Jeremiah O'Brien survive as museum ships 80 years after construction, tangible reminders of American industrial mobilization. They outlasted the entire Imperial Japanese Navy by decades. Proof that sufficient quantity produced with acceptable quality defeats perfection produced in inadequate numbers. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.